I'd like to welcome in my right-hand person here at GRE, Aundrea Newbern. You can also think of her as the woman with all of the letters behind her name, more than I have. She is the COO of GRE. She has her MBA. She is a licensed agent, therefore an NAR member as well. And that's just so different than me. I'm still trying to come up with the best title for myself. Shaved mammal, maybe, something like that. I do have my BA in geography and regional planning. About a third of the way through graduate school, I was going after my master's in geography. I dropped out thinking I had enough schooling, and I think it turned out that was probably the right decision for me. Aundrea, welcome in.
Thank you. You make me sound smarter than I am. I appreciate it, but definitely make me sound smarter, Keith.
Well, we're really here to borrow from your experience more so than talk about formal education today. And being an active real estate investor for years like you have been, you have both some successes and some failures in real estate, just like any active real estate investor will. And really, I think the mistakes are where the lessons come from, and the successes are why we do this. So talk to us about that.
Most of my bigger mistakes were made at the beginning of investing, which I think is pretty common, but there's been a couple that I've made more recently, and I'll talk about that. The first would be not properly evaluating a property during due diligence. Earlier in my investing career, I had an instance where I did not properly look at a property to make sure that it was high enough as far as elevation from the properties around it. And it actually kind of sat in a basin. And so it was my first purchase that was not a single family. So it was a 4-unit property. And the day I closed on it, a hurricane hit and that entire property flooded. So if I had actually been a little bit smarter and looked to see, okay, here's the elevation on both sides, there's, an opportunity for something to happen if we had a very rare occurrence like a hurricane, that would have never happened to me. And it did cost me a lot of money at the time.
Gosh. Actually, there's more of a parallel there with something that I had happen to me. The first full day I ever owned a fourplex building, we actually recorded on one day. And then the next day, the first full day that I owned it, one of those fourplex tenants barely knew how to get a hold of me, but I did leave them with my phone number. She got a hold of me that her old water heater was leaking all over the place, and I had to replace that my first full day. So it's similar because it was another sort of water problem. Was there anything there that might have tipped you off had you not been a new investor in that instance, Aundrea? Maybe where you saw something that had to do with floodplain information in the closing documents or anything like that?
Actually, no. So this home was not in a flood area. It did not have a history of flooding because that has to be disclosed. There was none of that. There had been no insurance claims. So nothing that would have tipped me off other than actually sitting back and looking at where the property was, and the two beside it were higher. So if I had just opened my eyes a little bit better, I would have realized this.
That's interesting. And insurance didn't help you out there.
They did not. So that was another interesting thing, is this would require a flood policy. I did have a landlord insurance, but not a flood policy. Had I been able to transfer the flood policy from the prior owner to me, I would have been able to get some coverage potentially. But I couldn't have even got my own flood policy at the time because it was during hurricane season and there was one already coming that way. So I wouldn't have been able to lock it in before the moratoriums on flood insurance were in. So.
Well, sometimes the worst stories make for the best lessons.
Yeah, I mean, there's another little one related to this where I made the mistake twice. So my learning curve is not good, but it's also about due diligence. Older homes down in the South were made with cast iron pipes. And when I first started as an investor, I didn't get the pipes scoped to make sure they weren't corroded if they were, 40, 50 years old. And so I had 2 different properties that I ended up having to do a full replacement of the pipes underneath the home on a slab. And I did it back to back with 2 properties. So learning curve's not good, but now I know to get those scoped. And those are little things you don't think of necessarily until you're a little bit more experienced investing.
Right. A person wouldn't think of that. Now, oftentimes a beginner, a brand new real estate investor, they aren't experts in a lot of these things, from the roof to the foundation and a lot of other things. So this is why I recommend, even for new build properties, brand new construction properties, that one get an independent third-party inspection. So did you have that done in each of those cases? Did that help out?
I did, and I don't feel like they really helped in this scenario. And the reason being, on all the reports, when it's related to plumbing, the inspector will say, if you want plumbing, examined thoroughly, you should contact a licensed plumber for additional inspection. And it says it on all the reports. So I just kind of passed over it on this one. if I had thought about it or known, I would have actually had a specialized plumber come in and actually put a camera down the drain. So I don't know that the inspection helped me there, but I should have actually followed what it said to have a licensed plumber come in and look at things irrespective of what the situation was.
Yeah, that's a good lesson. And in my experience, I always have the third-party inspection done. And there have been times where I've decided not to close on a property because of some of the inspection findings for what I'll call that general third-party home inspector. I have had instances where that general home inspector, they're pretty knowledgeable if they're experienced, and they typically have some letters behind their name, though not as many as yours, Aundrea. But oftentimes that third-party inspector, they might say something like, I'm not a foundation expert, but I see a potential problem with foundation settling there. So I recommend a separate independent specialist, a foundation inspector, come out here. Or I've also had that recommendation with a general inspector looking at the furnace and saying, oh, you know what, I think you should have a separate mechanical inspection. And I can refer you to a good person. So oftentimes that can be a good thing to follow up on, just another form of cheap insurance. But sometimes you're in the heat of the deal and you just kind of want to get closed and you have these other timelines that you're thinking about, and it can tempt one to want to close sooner than they should sometimes. But the good news here for prospective buyers is you do have those tools available to you. It's very common to have an inspection contingency, especially since we reverted back to a more normal market a few months ago.
That's right. Exactly. One of the things that kind of comes to mind as far as mistakes I've made since we're on that path, not partnering with people quicker, Keith. So my first, 30 plus units that I obtained, they were all by myself, my own money, my own financing. And it wasn't until maybe the last year and a half, 2 years that I started bringing in partners to do joint ventures with on properties, or even hard money lenders in some instances. Had I done that sooner, I'd have a lot more than what I currently have.
That's a good point. And some people need to consider that a mortgage loan officer is part of their team, and that can help one get leverage. Some people that are new to real estate are opposed to leverage. They think, why get a loan if I don't have to? But are there any particular things with some of these partnerships that you're talking about that really helped out, something that partner brought to the relationship that you didn't have?
Yeah, absolutely. Right now, I've partnered with a wholesaler, actually out of another state that I just happened to meet online, which I know sounds crazy, but I vetted them pretty well. And this person is an absolute expert at marketing. And so what he does is he actually does all of the marketing for me for us to find properties that we're looking at off market. He gets those. Sometimes he even brings the hard money. Sometimes I bring the money. It just depends. But he's doing the marketing, which I don't have as much expertise as he does. So that's one good example of that.
That power of networking, using a team, using partners.
Yep, exactly. I'm continuing to do that. I wish I'd done it, 6-7 years ago. I didn't, but that's okay. You live, you learn, right? One that kind of hits home and may kind of impact a lot of people listening to this. In 2018, I was convinced that the market was at its peak. And so I sold a couple of properties. I should have held on to those properties. I shouldn't have made an assumption about what was going on in the market. And I also put the brakes just a little bit on my purchases. I see a lot of people doing that now. They're scared of what's going on with the market. It's different than what they've experienced the last year or two. So they're not buying, or they're holding off on buying at the moment. And that's something that I made a mistake by doing. I would have a lot more properties and a lot more equity and a lot more cash flow if I had have stopped in 2018 when I did.
That's a great lesson. It's tempting to want to time the market. And most people think about timing the market, they peer through that solely of a lens of home price appreciation rates and what they think those are going to do. Yes, there are some others like mortgage rates and so on. But, as I've been talking about in this environment, appreciation is slowing. Cash flow is on the increase. Loan pay down by your tenant is somewhat on the decrease since mortgage rates are up. The tax benefits are about the same. And that inflation profiting benefit is substantially up. So right now, of the 5 ways you're paid, 2 are increasing, 2 are waning, and 1 is the same. So it's a pretty normal market solely through that perspective. That's the way that I like to think of things. So yeah, it's really about investing. That's really the definition, when you can control something rather than speculating in what you think are going to happen. But yeah, that's such an easy trap to fall into.
It really is. So that's my third one. And that's something that I'm kind of kicking myself more so than maybe even the first 2 now.
Right. Waiting typically costs someone in income property. So with those being the failures, the mistakes you've made, the things you wish you could go back and change, which are great. That's where we get the lessons. Let's talk about some of those successes and the reasons for doing this. And yes, a lot of times they are selfish And there's nothing wrong with being selfish. Being selfish is not fallible all the time. In fact, you need to take care of yourself before you can take care of anyone else. Let's talk about why we're doing this and some of the good successes you've had.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think one of the things that I've been able to do really well over the years is find the right partners. You touched on this a bit when we talked about kind of mistakes that we've made. I did make some mistakes with partners at first, but I quickly learned how to vet properly. So do my analysis, make sure, if it's a vendor, for example, that they're licensed, they're insured, ask for references, get a contract. But having the right partners really is key, especially if you're investing in somewhere that you don't live in that local market, which I know a lot of us are. So that's one of the things I've done well. I've got my team in place in the areas I invest in, and things just kind of run. It's just a wheel that keeps moving.
Being a quality person attracts other quality people. Oftentimes, a best practice in formalizing that in DocuSign, it might feel awkward, but just in drafting a DocuSign document, oftentimes you and your partner, you find out something that you hadn't previously discussed before.
That's absolutely right. You got it.
All right. So somewhat turning a failure into a success there with learning how to be a better partner and vet better partners.
Yep. So that's my first one. The second thing I think I've done a fairly good job of is having a good mix across my portfolio. And what I mean by that is I do have mostly single families, and I have a strong preference for that for a lot of reasons. But I've also mixed in a few multifamily with there, and then I've mixed kind of my strategy with my rentals. So I have a lot of long-term, unfurnished rentals, which I like the most. But then I have a few short-term, which bring me a lot of cash flow, higher risk, but more cash flow. And then the multifamilies are just really, really stable and have great cash flow as well. So I think that's one of my successes is having a mix and not just one type of everything across the board.
Oh, yeah. So many pros and cons with those different types. Apartments and multifamily have a scale advantage. Single family homes can be great for a lot of reasons. You'll typically get better appreciation over time on single family homes. Tenants will retain longer because single family homes tend to be in better school districts than apartments are, and just so many pros and cons there. And then, the pros and cons with long-term rentals and short-term rentals. One great piece of conventional wisdom is a lot of people that buy short-term rentals buy that through the lens of, now, if I had to fall back on this and make it a long-term rental, would that still work?
Exactly. You're exactly right on that. Yeah. So I think that's my second. My third, I am probably less risk adverse than a lot of people. So I never had a problem just kind of pulling the trigger and moving forward with purchasing properties. And so what I call that is analysis paralysis, when you can't move forward and you're just overanalyzing everything. I don't have that. So I was able to scale pretty fast while working a full-time job to be able to get those units. And I'm so glad I did that and I didn't pump the brakes on everything.
You are an action taker. And, we talked about learning and formal education here near the start of this discussion. But as we know, the real learning takes place when you get involved, especially when you own a property directly yourself. Is there anything that you learned in formal education that really helped you here now that we've talked about your successes and your failures? Or are there any number of things that might have transferred over, or any one particular nugget that you can think of?
Man, if I could go back and not go to college, I would 100% have not done my degrees. 100%, Keith. I think you were smart to leave your master's program, probably. But corporate America did teach me a lot. It taught me a lot with systems and a lot with relationship building, especially with the relationship building and networking. So yeah, there were a lot of positives to it, but the degrees, I'd toss them if I could. Continue to reanalyze and reevaluate the things that you've done and that are working and the things that you're doing that aren't working, and figure out things you need to cut as far as your systems go, your processes, even your partners and people you're working with, and your strategy. So I think people should do that periodically. I try to do it at least quarterly, but at least annually, take a look at that. And that's all I think I'd add to it.
Oh, there's so many good condensed lessons here. No wonder I have you on the show so often.
Thank you so much, Keith. I appreciate it.